Our Life Odyssey Part 2, the Part 1 really for Milt Hildebrand. Very well beloved in this community with a life of exploration, academics, military service, sex education, terrific family life, outdoorsman, a published author. There are many, many aspects to the career and life of Milt Hildebrand, and I'm so honored to be here with you today, Milt. You have a very particular schedule you'd like to follow, and I'm going to just kind of introduce section by section as he goes into the plan, and you've chosen to start with your childhood.
Well, good afternoon, friends. Can't you hear me all right without that thing? Oh. The camera, I have to do it. All right, hello. Is it on?
Yes. Yeah. Fine.
Well, 94 years and half an hour works out to be 20 seconds per year. So time to get going. I was born in Philadelphia, but my parents brought me to California when I was 6 months old.
On a covered wagon?
I'm going to skip ahead to the time of my first memories. In 1923, when I was 5, a fire broke out in the Berkeley Hills on a hot, dry, windy day, swept down into the city, and burned 584 homes to the ground, including ours. The 6 of us, I had 3 siblings, squeezed into the family car, square, black, hood ornament, running boards, and drove to the little seaside town of Capitola near Santa Cruz. My folks had a small summer cottage there. That's where I learned to swim in the freshwater lagoon behind the beach. I learned left from right because my little coveralls had a pocket on the left. Soon we went to a house that my dad found to rent in the unburned part of Berkeley. 2 things I remember: there was a scary dog nearby, and occasionally I could walk with my mother to a little mom and pop grocery store where she bought me animal crackers. Did you know that animal crackers have to be eaten in a certain sequence? Saving the elephants for last? Well, meanwhile, our new home was under construction. Nowadays, interior walls are completed with sheetrock. There was no sheetrock in those days. I remember seeing plaster slopped onto a scaffold of laths and chicken wire to make the interior walls. We had a long, curving driveway that went uphill. I saw that graded with a horse pulling a big scoop. Now, most of my peers in high school, all of my peers in high school, and many of them also into college, didn't know what they were going to do when they grew up. I knew very early on that I was going to be a nature man. Well, that was 6-year-old speak for Professor of Zoology. And about that same age, he used to lecture to 400 students at a time without this darn thing. At about that same age, I started collecting skulls and skeletons that I found along trails and at beaches. I knew that my parents approved because they furnished me with shelves and drawers where I could keep my treasures. And occasionally when they entertained, they asked their guests if they would like to go upstairs and see little Milton's bones. Through my school days, my family pioneered skiing in the winters. No ski lodges, no ski lifts, no antifreeze. And in the summers, we hiked in the High Sierra, packing all our duffel on burros. In 1929, when I was 11, my dad took a sabbatical and the family went to Europe for a year. While our parents and big sister were in Munich, near the university, my two brothers and I were in a boarding school in Switzerland, high up on a ridge. When I returned from that trip abroad, my father had to figure out what to do about my schooling. I had completed the 6th grade before the trip started. Well, considering that in Switzerland I learned only a little skiing, a little German, it would have been logical for me to go into the 7th grade. But it had been a year, so Dad decided I better skip the 7th grade. Oh, while we're at it, let's skip the 8th grade too. So he put me into the 9th grade, a big unfamiliar school in far off Oakland. It was one of the most stressful times in my life. But the A I got in algebra proved to my father that the 7th and 8th grades were completely superfluous. That sort of was the end of my childhood.
Very nice. Very, very nice. And that set the stage for things which will come later in stories we're about to hear. And now we're moving into your youth and middle years, middle school years.
Okay, in middle school, I located a one-man hole-in-the-wall business in Oakland, well, about the border between Berkeley and Oakland, with a presumptuous title of Pacific Coast Biological Supply. He had a very grimy leopard skull. I said, if you let me take that home, I'll clean it for you. I did, and he was impressed. So he gave me a bullfrog. I took that home, and I cleaned and mounted the skeleton of that poor frog, and sold it back to Mr. Pacific Coast Biological Supply. He gave me more frogs. Starting in 1938, the Sierra Club Outing Committee inaugurated a new kind of a summer outing called the Burro Trips. Each party would consist of 20 people, 12 burros, go into the High Sierra for 2 weeks. There'd be one leader. They were to be taught how to care for and pack the animals, how to bake in a reflector oven, how to distinguish the different pine trees and flowers and animals. I was the leader of those outings over several years and 9 different times. At about the same time in my life, I was doing a lot of backpacking. And sometimes with college friends, but mostly with my 2 brothers, one older, one younger. And those are about the best time of my life. We spent some of the time lying on our back in meadows among the flowers, listening to the birds, and we spent a lot of time climbing mountains. Altogether, I climbed made 67 ascents of peaks 11,000 feet or higher. None of us was a good rock climber, really, by modern standards, not at all. But we carried a climbing rope, and we used it as needed for safety and to rappel and so forth. Now, in 1939, I signed up for a upper division botany course with the gymnosperms, the needle trees. The laboratory, they had small tables and with 2 students sitting on each side. Sitting across from me was a very attractive young girl. Her name was Viola. 1941 and 42, one of my paleontology professors organized a little shoestring expedition to El Salvador to collect specimens for museums. He asked some of his students to go along. I was the mammalogist. There was somebody else collected birds and others collected reptiles, and there was a botanist along also. Now, that trip lasted for 6 months when I was 23 years old.
That was UC Berkeley we're talking about.
Yes.
The botany class where
Yes.
Viola was across the table from you.
Yeah.
And when you returned from El Salvador, your life took a about-face change because of the war.
Yes, I had been deferred briefly to take that trip, so I was drafted immediately upon my return. The 10th Mountain Division was being organized about that time, and initially the division was taking only volunteers, so that it was a special unit right from the start. My application had been accepted, but somehow my papers got mixed up and they sent me to Tennessee. My second day there, the sergeant discovered that I had a shirt on my hanger with an unbuttoned pocket. Well, you can't beat Hitler with that kind of lax discipline. So he ordered me to cut a lawn for half an hour with a pair of scissors. I was in the wrong place, the wrong unit. I hated cutting the lawn with a pair of scissors. I hated the sergeant. It was about the lowest, most depressed part of my life. But all was not lost, because at the end of the war, I was the first lieutenant, and that sergeant had been busted to private for drunken, disorderly conduct. So listen up, you you-yos, doubting you-yos. There is a God. Well, finally, the Army figured out where I was and where I was supposed to be, and I joined the mountain troops, 10th Mountain Division. Our new encampment was in Colorado in a valley at 9,200 feet. It was decided that as many troops in the division as possible should learn, and what again is noise here?
I think it just needs to be another inch away.
Okay, I got the hang of this darn thing, and I must practice. It was decided as many troops as possible should learn to travel over snow. So a huge ski school was set up, not in the valley, but 5 miles up the road at 10,400 feet. They would truck soldiers up there 500 at a time. There were some CCO, the Civilian Conservation Corps barracks there. So each group of soldiers would stay for 5 days and take ski instruction full-time. I was an instructor and a supervisor in that school. They planned to have a camp out and a maneuver, winter maneuver, at a frozen lake that was at 11,000 feet. Timberline came just up to the lower end of that lake, and that's where the soldiers were to set up their little two-man tents. Rising above the upper end of the lake was a long, I guess about 1,500-foot steep rise up to the shoulder of a 13,200-foot peak. Now, the manual said that they had to have 2 safety advisors. The command in Colorado had no idea where to get 2 safety advisors, so they asked Washington to furnish them. Word came back from Washington, your safety advisors will be Corporal Hanks and Private Hildebrand from your own troops. The request had been passed around in Washington until it came to the attention of 2 officers who were Sierra Clubbers. They knew us and had skied with us, and they knew that Hanks and I each had this pin. On the pin you see a steep mountain with a ski track coming down, and below it says Sierra Club, and above it says Ski Mountaineers. To get that pin, one had to be a reasonably proficient skier, not only on groomed slopes, but also in soft and crusted snow. One had to have experienced ski touring and snow camping. One had to have some idea what to do about a broken ski or a broken leg. And one had to pass an examination on avalanche safety. So one of the other of us was to guide every group of soldiers whose assignments required that they climb up above the encampment. For instance, I guided an officer and several men up the top of a high ridge so that they could set up an imaginary observation post for imaginary artillery. Then the commander of the maneuver, who was a colonel, was obliged to follow all the suggestions made by the corporal and the private and related to safety. Among other things, we said, don't let any soldiers go out on the frozen lake. Well, we were criticized for that. Come on, guys. The ice on that lake is literally 4 feet thick. Nobody's going to fall through. And we said, we know, don't go out on the lake. They had a howitzer at the encampment. A howitzer is a small, short-barreled cannon. It had been hauled up there on a toboggan pulled by sled dogs. The last day of the maneuver, well, lasted for 10 days, they used that howitzer to fire here and there. Finally, a round hit the top of that long, steep slope above the head of the lake. The explosion set off an avalanche that hit the lake with such force that that half-mile-long, 4 feet thick block of ice lurched as a unit, fracturing over much of its surface. And where the avalanche had struck, there was a huge jumble of snow and blocks of ice the size of refrigerators that had been blasted out. Hanks and I cheered. Well, as the snow began to melt, I was one of about 20 soldiers in a newly established unit called the Mountain Training Group. We taught mountain travel and rock climbing to selected soldiers in 3 different divisions. Finally, my application for OCS Officer Candidate School came to the top of the pile, and I was off to Georgia for 3 months of hot, sticky training. On my graduation, I beat it back to Berkeley and married the girl from the other side of the pine cones. We had set up between us pine cones that we had to pretend to draw anyway. While we were supposed to be looking at pine cones, we were mostly looking at each other, so that was set up. The general who was in command of the 10th Mountain Division had been an elderly person whom the troops sort of regarded as a wimp. He disappeared and was replaced by a tough but fair-minded general. And then we knew we were about to go overseas.
That brings you to your time in combat with the 10th Mountain Division in the Apennine Mountains of northern Italy. Here the stage changes.
Right, we were in the Apennines. On the northern side of the Apennines is a big valley, Po Valley, like the Central Valley of California. On the other side is the foothills of the Alps. The Germans were entrenched on the high ridges in the Apennines, dug in there, and the approach slopes were all booby-trapped and mined. 3 times the Allied forces had tried to capture that high ground, and they had failed every time. 10th Mountain Division went into position below the highest land, and we captured all the high terrain, pushed the Germans back about 12 miles. This was a limited engagement. That was in February 1945. In April 14th, 1945, the Allied forces started the big push that was going to carry on to the Alps. The 10th Mountain Division was the spearhead of that. Behind us came other infantry units, a British artillery unit with huge cannons, more tanks than you could count, field hospitals, lots and lots of people all coming behind us. So we crossed over the Alps, down into the Po Valley, and onto the Po River. Po River has a lot of snowmelt from the Alps. It's a big river, at least as big as the Sacramento. And all the bridges were blown. I marvel still at the organization of the wartime effort of the Allied troops. There appeared like magic a fleet, I guess they call them, of vehicles. They called them ducks. They looked like 2.5-ton trucks. But you could drive them into the water and pull some levers and push some buttons, and the power went not to the wheels but to a propeller. And this way we lumbered across the Po. When we, well, I was going to say that within 48 hours, an engineering unit had constructed a pontoon bridge across the river that we could drive trucks and tanks over. We were ready to strike out of the bridgehead. Our orders had been to move fast, to disrupt the retreat of the German soldiers who had been occupying the northern Italy. I didn't tell you what I was doing, what my work was, my assignment was in the 10th Mountain Division. I was the executive officer of a battalion headquarters company. how the commander of the headquarters company has other duties, besides which he didn't like the enlisted men and they hated him, so he was rarely in the company area. So I was the acting company commander nearly all of the time. I was also the colonel's errand boy for miscellaneous things. Hildebrand, come go see why our mail's not coming through. Go find the mobile vans that served as shower units that moved around to where the troops were. And so on and so on. Go find us 200 feet of rope. And also, I became a battalion pack officer. I was supervising 40 mules to supply ammunition and K-rations to the troops that were on terrain that was too rough to get to with four-wheel drive vehicles.
That's where that early burro training came in handy.
Yes, that's
Yes.
right. I used to brag myself that I could pack all 12 burros using a different pack hitch on every one. I didn't do it because that would have been a big show-off, but I could have.
You have some very emotional vignettes from that time period that
Yes.
left a lasting impression on you.
For the actual combat, that's all I give you 4 vignettes, which sort of snapshots, which I've selected because of their emotional impact on me. First, I came onto the body of a dead German soldier, lying on his back, arms outstretched. In the dirt beyond the fingers of one of his hands was a photo of him, a woman, and 2 little children. War is not just us, the good guys, against them, the bad guys. War is lovers, fathers, sons, and brothers, killing lovers, fathers, sons, and brothers. Second vignette. A company officer had to censor all the outgoing mail. That was one of my jobs. It's not okay to write that in 3 days we will attack Gorgolesko. The troops knew the rules as well as I did. I rarely had to do anything but letters. And I disliked reading them because they were letters to mothers and sweethearts, and it was an intrusion for me to look over their shoulders. Just to comment on 2 of the letters. A soldier who had been pinned down for days because of incoming artillery and mortar fire, but had to hold his position against the possibility of counterattacks. There were counterattacks. Wrote that at the edge of his foxhole he could see flowers nodding in the breeze. And then he said, God puts flowers among us to shame us for what we are doing. A sergeant wrote to his young wife and infant son that it was getting dark. He would finish the letter in the morning. An artillery shell killed him as he slept in the room next to mine. Could just as easily have been my letter to my wife and infant son. Third vignette. Well, as I said, the mountain troops spearheaded the drive over the Alps and into the Po Valley.
Apennines?
Apennines, yes. And then after we left our bridgehead, we were to move rapidly to cut off the Germans' retreat. As the 10th Mountain Division, that was units of the division, too many men in the one division, 14,000 of them, they all marched together. As we marched into the outskirts of each little village, the words just spread like wildfire. People crowded beside our path of travel, waving, cheering, laughing, touching our outstretched hands, throwing flowers, handing out chunks of cheese and cups of wine to the troops as they passed along. Viva, viva Americani. Just jubilation, fueled by long hardship and subjugation. So I guess that's 3 vignettes. I've got one more to go. At 6:50 in the evening, on the 2nd of May, 1945, we heard over our crackling radios that the German army in Italy had surrendered. Our troops poured out in the open, milled about, cheered, shouted, fired their weapons in the air, went up in the church steeple to ring the bells. I came out of the cave where I'd been sheltering against artillery fire, and just sat on a big rock and let the emotions pour over me. Of the 14,000 men in the 10th Mountain Division, 1,000 had been killed, and many times that number had been wounded. I was weary and dirty, but I was unhurt. My 3.5 years in the Army would soon be winding down. I would go home to my family and my studies. There were no words to describe the feeling.
Very, very powerful, pivotal moment for this country, for yourself, and for all those who served. And powerful memories that you've just shared with us, Milt. The lessons of war, the lessons of peace. And now we take that tender time in your life and transition to UC Davis and your appointment here on the faculty.
It's so difficult for graduate students finishing their degrees to find suitable appointments. And I'm almost ashamed to tell you how it happened for me. I was a graduate teacher, this is 1948, in summer 1948. I was a graduate teaching assistant in the zoology department at Berkeley. I was teaching a summer session course. A vacancy occurred up here at Davis. I did not apply for it because although I had passed my all or nothing qualifying oral examination, I had not done a thesis. I was sharing an office with another graduate student who had just finished his thesis, and he had applied for the spot. The chairman for the department at Davis went down to Berkeley to meet him. Well, there was some reticence expressed, and the way I heard it, the chairman at Berkeley said to the chairman from Davis, "Why don't you talk to Hildebrand?" He did, and then half an hour later I'd been hired. There's a provision that had to go through the required committee approvals and so forth. I could do my thesis as I started lecturing here at Davis.
That brings us to a segment on accomplishments. You want to talk about what you feel you're proud of, pleased with, satisfied about in the course of your life.
Well, lots of things. My family's at the top of the list. I am privileged to have 3 very loving, supportive children. One of them there. And I have 5 very satisfactory grandchildren who are the good parents of 7 adorable great-grandchildren. I just am enormously fortunate. There are 2 nieces here, my extended family. They are both very good huggers. And I can tell you how that happens. It's because we practice a lot. Well, second on my list of things that I look back on with pleasure would be my teaching. I did enough research to be advanced without being held back at each of my promotions, but my teaching was more to my pleasure than my research, actually. I taught 9 different courses altogether at Davis, but 4 principal courses. 2 of those were about the comparative anatomy of animals with backbones. One of the courses interpreted the structure of vertebrate animals in terms of their ancestry. Take a familiar example. Huge whales have hip bones about this long and thigh bones about this long buried in their flesh. That's because their ancestors walked on dry land. The other course interpreted the structure of the animals in terms of their locomotor and feeding adaptations. For instance, the armadillo, which is a powerful digger, has this ulna bone, the forearm bone, continue past the joint about half as far as it comes in front. That's because that projection is the lever arm for the triceps muscle, which extends the arm when the armadillo digs. Don't ever challenge an armadillo to a hand wrestle. Then I taught the 3rd principal course was embryology, which I taught for 14 years. My last lecture in that course was about pregnancy and childbirth. After a few years, students began coming to that course who were not enrolled. They stood around the walls and sat down the aisle. After a while, the Associated Students organization invited me to give that lecture as an open evening lecture. I didn't think that was quite right as a standalone lecture, so instead I gave a lecture on facts about sex and thoughts about love. It was scheduled in an auditorium with 200 seats. At the last minute, had to be relocated because 400 students came. You see, in those days, this is the mid-60s, it was just loosening up enough that church didn't prohibit people from saying dirty words if you did them in appropriate groups and for appropriate reasons. But there were no textbooks on human sexuality. There was no internet. There was no Google. People were hungry. Well, over the next several years, I was asked to give that talk to the Sacramento Physicians Organization, to the Area Nurses Organization, to school administrators, school counselors, the Veterinary Students Organization, the PTA, and let's see, assemblies at 2 state colleges, and on and on. Well, there seemed to be a message there. So I suggested to my department that I teach a course in human sexuality. Well, my colleagues discussed this at 2 faculty meetings, which I was asked not to attend. And then in their wisdom, they voted not to sponsor it. A naughty subject would reflect poorly upon the department. Besides, it's not zoology. True, that's part of the problem. If a PE department taught human sexuality, it was about pibbles and so forth. If it was the anthropology department, it was strange things that strange people do in strange places. It was the physiology department. It was ovarian and pituitary hormones. If it was the church, it was about abstinence and sin. By the anatomy department, it was Bartholin's glands and the epididymis and corpus cavernosum. Well, I found another department, human development, to sponsor, take a chance on my course. Chairman thought there might be a big class, maybe 70 students. Well, that first year, the enrollment doubled at each lecture until I had 700. Over the 14 years that I taught the course, the average enrollment was 1,250. 3 lecture sections in the largest lecture halls on campus. And toward the end of that period, the zoology department decided they'd sponsor it after all. I told them too late.
And Milt, in your teaching legacy, you say that you had about 24,000 students.
Yes, they are my legacy.
They are definitely your legacy.
I was in all of the different courses I taught, 24,000 students.
Should I read now some of the teaching awards that you have received in your career? First of all was the Golden Apple Award from the Associated Students in deep appreciation for your outstanding teaching and concern for students. That was in the 1960s. I believe these are over on the table here for people to take a look at. The second was a citation for distinguished teaching from the Academic Senate in 1973. And number 3, on behalf of the 17,500 students whose lives were enriched by the course in human sexuality from 1968 to 1982, the Department of Zoology and the Division of Biological Sciences hereby expresses great appreciation to Professor Milt Hildebrand for his courage in creating the course, for his excellence as a teacher, and for the wisdom, integrity, and humor which he brings to the classroom. Congratulations.
I can tell you about another expression of appreciation for that course. A young couple came to my door, she in her white wedding gown, he in a tuxedo. They had come to bring me a bottle of champagne from their wedding reception.
All right, what else that is on your bucket list that you've done and been pleased with and felt good about?
My family and my teaching. Well, I've been involved in the writing of 4 books, chief among which in my textbook. It's now in a 5th edition. It's been in print for 38 years, which is longer than any other text in the field. And it's been translated into German, Spanish, Portuguese, and Italian. So I guess I have to be satisfied with that. Yeah, that's it.
How about your book of poetry and sexuality?
So that's the
At
one.
the time that I was teaching a sexuality course, I wrote a lot of sexy verses, and that's what that book is.
That's a good one.
It's coming around, Laugh and Love.
Let's see. I was going to mention also things that I'm pleased with. That collection I started when I was 6 years old grew to be, I believe, the largest private teaching collection of its kind in the country. I used exchange specimens. For instance, kangaroo rats are only found in Western North America, and they're easy to catch. But I would send kangaroo rats to a collector in Russia, and I'd get gerboas back, and so on. All I had specimens from all over the world, and when I retired, I donated 2,000 specimens to the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology on the Berkeley campus.
That brings us to the relationship with this church and this community, which is the last section of Milton's presentation, where he and Viola were very active in the early days of the fellowship. So, Milt, would you please tell us about that?
Well, Viola did the landscape design for this whole establishment here. Where the parking lots would be, where the church would be, the swale, the little bridge, the whole works. She said it made her feel very powerful to stand out there and guide the bulldozers. She also took her turns at arranging flowers and making special decorations. This is back in the 1950s. I served in the worship committee. I served in the search committee that brought our first minister. I chaperoned the LRY on trips to the beach. Hard to keep track of that group.
Youth.
Yeah.
Youth group.
Yeah, liberal and religious youth. And I carried a lot of buckets of water to our baby pine trees. I gave 11 sermons. We had no minister, we had to take turns. Some of those sermons were repeated at congregations in Sacramento, Berkeley, Monterey, San Diego, Fresno. Maybe I'll let some of them out. But anyway, it's not that they were that good. They were not. It's just that in those days there were a lot of desperate program chairmen. And somehow they'd gotten the word that there was a guy up at Davis who would talk to you if you just fed him cookies. I think that I could claim that I have been a UU in spirit since before I even knew about the church. And I'm going to cite 3 indications of that is 7. Occasionally on campus, there would be a mismatch. Not frequently, but it happened. A mismatch between a graduate student and the assigned faculty mentor. The student just felt they were not getting the attention and the help that forthcoming that they needed. When that happened, I'm the guy they came to talk about it. Usually I could help one way or another. I have told you that in combat, our company commander was not held in high regard by the men. It's not a good idea for a commander to mete out harsh disciplines for trivial and imaginary shortcomings to combat soldiers who are doing their best and risking their lives. So All of the corporals and the sergeants in the battalion called a meeting to talk it over and see if there's anything at all they could do. There isn't much you can do when an officer gives you a command in the Army. You have to follow it. All of these men were in platoons commanded by a second lieutenant. They weren't even told that the meeting was going to occur, but they invited me to attend and asked for my comments. Third indication is that over there's a certificate I got. In the 1970s, women's lib was a big cause on the campus. And I got a certificate for significant contributions to the status of women at UC Davis. What did I do? Well, turns out that I got it because in my lectures in human sexuality, I was quite critical of the stereotype of the macho, high T male sexual partner. And I was very supportive of fairness and equality and consideration and appreciation for women. But a certificate, shouldn't everyone be fair and respectful, supportive of everybody else? Besides, I like being appreciative and supportive of women. God has arranged it that way. But who knows, when I stand before the committee that must decide if I will or will not be allowed to enter the UU enclave in heaven, that certificate just might tip the balance in my favor.
Wonderful, Milt. With that, let's open this up to comments, audience, interaction, shared memories with Milt Hildebrand.
What happened with the commanding officer that you had to meet about to find out all the troops?
The question.
What happened to him? You were
What happened to
waiting
him?
for him.
Well, that's an interesting story too. He decided after the war he wanted to be a dentist. He came to the Berkeley campus to take his pre-dental course. It looked for a while as though he might have to take a zoology 1A would be one of his required courses. But I might be his teaching assistant. But that didn't happen. Because first he had to take chemistry 1A. And he took that from my father and he flunked it.
Great stories. I've been told that we have another event coming into the room at 2:30. So with that, I would like to give a round of applause to Milt.